Everybody, good evening. Welcome to this event hosted by the School of Public Policy at the LSE. My name is Andres Velasco. I am the Dean of the School of Public Policy, and I am delighted to see this room full of people who want to think big thoughts about a very big set of issues. And for the Americans in the room, happy Thanksgiving, I suppose. So we all know that the world is changing. Some people would even claim that the post-war liberal international order is falling apart. Many things are changing, not the least of which is the emergence of China. Technology is changing very, very quickly. We didn't think we would have a conventional war on the European continent, but alas, and sadly, we have one. The big question, of course, is that, what this all means for the way we conduct international affairs, for the traditional institutions that the world came to depend on after World War II, for things like the Bretton Woods twins, the IMF and the World Bank, and for governance on planet Earth more broadly. And, these big questions are above my pay grade, but we have some people who are very well equipped to tell us how to think about these issues and how to move forward. But before I do that, let me just take care of some housekeeping. Please place your phones on silent. The event is being recorded. There will be a podcast so that the world at large can hear whatever is said here tonight. We will have a chance for questions toward the end. For the audience online, please upload your questions to the chat function, and we will do our best to get some questions from the online audience as well. And we may not have time for everybody, but we will endeavor to get a mixture of questions, both from the live audience and the online audience. And last but not least, for people who use what used to be called Twitter, nowadays known as X, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSE Public Policy. So I am honored and delighted to introduce our very distinguished speakers, beginning with Sir Vince Cable, who is Professor of Practice in the School of Public Policy at the LSE. We've been delighted to be hosting Vince for a couple of years now. He was Secretary of State for Business, Innovations and Skills and President of the Board of Trade in the UK, and he was, of course, the leader of the Lib Dems in Parliament. Neil Ferguson is also a visiting professor at the School of Public Policy. He is a Milbank Senior Fellow at Hoover, Stanford, California, Hoover Institution, I should say, at Stanford University. And he has a bunch of other qualifications that I'm going to skip because we want to get to the meat of the matter. But as the cliche goes, he needs no introduction. He's published lots of very influential and widely read books. And Rebecca Naden is the Director for Global Risks and Resilience at the Overseas Development Council. And she has had a very distinguished career on issues such as climate risk, national adaptation, and designing and managing multi-stakeholder climate change initiatives. And of course, he is a China specialist, which comes in very handy given the issues that we're going to talk about this evening. So we're going to begin with Vince, who will open the dialogue, and then we will move on to remarks by Neil and Rebecca. I will use chair's privilege to ask a question or two, if I may, and then the floor is yours. Vince, without further ado, voila. Thank you very much.
Not connecting yet.
Again, please. Lovely.
Right. The basis of the discussion tonight is really about the significance of the emergence of China and India as sort of economic superstates, call them that. Depending on how it's measured, the second and fifth biggest economies in the world, or the first and the third. And this obviously has implications for the way the world's run and the way it's evolving, and particularly in relation to the United States. And we have four of these discussions, the last on economics, this one on the links essentially between economics and governance, and the next one will be about energy, climate change. Nick Stern is going to participate with me on that one. But I want to say a little bit about the shifting economic balance, about what this means in terms of the Bretton Woods Institutions, of key international financial bodies, and there's something about these new groupings that are emerging in a rather fragmented global governance system, something specifically about currency convertibility and currencies that are now has written about this and will talk much more than myself. And then lastly, something about the relationship between China and India themselves, not just about their impact on the world economy. So let's start with the first. This is one way of representing the changing shares in the world economy. There are two ways of doing this. As you know, you can take the existing GDP and existing exchange rates and market prices, which tends to show the United States as significantly the biggest economy in the world, followed by China. But on most plausible projections, China would be expected to pass probably the end of this decade, but who knows? I mean, we can't predict the future. But there is another way of looking at the world, which is in terms of purchasing power, which allows for the fact that different countries have different price levels, that the current exchange rates don't necessarily reflect that. And on the basis of the World Bank, IMF, UN measurements, this is in a way a better representation of the way the world actually looks. Now, you could argue if we're talking about global governance, we need to be looking at market rates and interaction with the world economy. But in terms of sheer size, about stuff that is produced and consumed, this may be a better way of looking at it. 2025, just looking forward the next few years based on kind of recent growth rates, and fairly plausible. China is emerging as the largest of the three, but India is, almost 10% of the world economy on this measure. And on the basis of the kind of growth rates which I've fed into this, which are, fairly commonly used in OECD projections or some of the leading investment banks, you see that over the next 20 to 30 years, the US will probably, and none of us know, probably decline, relatively speaking. China will increase, but it's getting near its peak in terms of the share of the world economy. But the big change is India coming up to be, in a couple of 3 decades, probably number 2. This is purely in terms of economic size. What does this mean for decision-making and governance? Well, what I've done here is just put down on one side the share of the world economy, on the left purchasing power based, and in brackets based on nominal current GNP, and contrasted that with the voting within the IMF and the World Bank. And you'll see that because the voting shares were largely determined, there's been some adaptation, but were largely determined by the relative importance of countries when these bodies were established. There's now quite a big gap opened up between the role of the big emerging markets and their share of voting in the institutions. So China and India, as you see the figures there, something like getting on for 20% of the world economy, but 6% of voting within the Bretton Woods Institutions. India, similarly, getting on for 8% of the world economy, but 3% in the IFIs. On the other hand, most of the main developed economies, Japan, Germany, the UK, France, overrepresented. Same is true as the regional banks. I've got the Asian Development Bank here. And this has led to a sort of permanent sort of discontent and frustration about the global governance arrangement. There not a great deal has been done about it, and countries like the UK are hanging on to their shares. But the Chinese have kind of in a way broken away from this. They established a China-dominated bank, the Asia Infrastructure Bank. There's a bit of a politics around this. I was approached when I was in the government together with George Osborne and Daddy Alexander to whether Britain wanted to be a founding member. We're very strongly opposed by the US. We got messages from President Obama that this was not something the Americans wanted us to do, but I think we're one of the relatively few cases where the British kicked over the traces and we decided to join anyway. As you see, the UK is a shareholding member, though Japan and the United States have boycotted it. And China and India are now the two biggest shareholders, and to understand, certainly from Danny Alexander, is now vice president, and Eric Bearclough was a former LSE professor colleague here, who's their chief economist, that this is now a very effective functioning institution, very much under Chinese indirect guidance, but operating as an independent professional body, trying to collaborate with the World Bank, trying to be, a good team player, but trying to do innovative stuff around climate finance. It's an interesting example of how the Chinese are trying to use their influence in this world. But this is somewhat more trying to show here the sort of the sheer messiness of what's now beginning to emerge in terms of governance structures. We've got the apex bodies here. You could say that lying behind this is, of course, the hegemonic role of the United States in establishing the post-war order. But at the top, you have, of course, the UN, the Bretton Woods bodies, and the World Trade Organization, which is now effectively moribund because of the Trump boycotting of the appellate body. But if you wanted to ask the question, who runs the world economy, it's not terribly clear who it is, but, the G20 would have a reasonable claim to be at the center of it. You remember Gordon Brown convening this meeting in London in the aftermath of the world financial crisis. But the G20 structure has sort of slightly, rather now breaking up, and you're getting a sort of polarization around the G7 and around the BRICs group, particularly this year. The Chinese making a great deal of the BRICs group and wanting to get it extended. Saudi, Iran, Argentina, other countries now being brought in, setting up its own institutions, BRICs Bank, for example. But underneath it, there is another cluster of majorly regionally based groups, some of which, like the European Union, of course, have a great deal of significance in economic terms. They reform NAFTA, ASEAN in Southeast Asia. But the two that are worth focusing on, one is the CGTPP, which is originally proposed by President Obama, and it was probably best described as something to keep America in and the Chinese out in relation to the Asia Pacific. But ironically, the Americans are out and the Chinese are trying to get in. And another very odd feature of it, you see that one of its members is the UK. The UK has reclassified itself as an Asian country and has joined this CGTPP. The conspiracy theorists think that the Americans encouraged us to join so that we could then veto Chinese application. I don't know, that's a bit wild, but this is certainly a very important structure certainly within the Asia Pacific system of governance. If it is realized, it will be an Asian equivalent of the European single market with deep integration, convergence of standards. The other grouping which is important is the RCEP, which is mostly Asian rather than the American side of the Pacific. In some ways a China-dominated group, less deep integration, but nonetheless important and making some headway. But India, despite being Asia, South Asia, has declined to join it. The Indians thought it was too committed to breaking down trade barriers. Perhaps also just mention the Shanghai group. I'll come back to that later. This is a grouping where India, Russia, and China work together. This is not about economics. This is primarily about security overlaps concerned with terrorism in Asia and related problems. But this is a very simplified map of what is becoming a very complex global governance structure. Just to say a little bit about the power of currencies, and now we'll develop this a little bit later. But you see, on almost any measure, reserves, transactions, or the IMF allocation of currencies under the basket, of course, the dollar dominates, and there are very good reasons for that. The dollar is a very good store of value. Very few other countries are. The euro is in some ways competitive, but the little red slice, which is the Chinese currency, the RMB, simply doesn't figure. But we shouldn't just take that as the final story. Within the last few months, the Chinese currency share of transactions has doubled from 3 to 6%. And this is partly because the Chinese are now insisting that relationships with countries which they have a deep relationship, and there are, I think, 2/3 of the countries of the world now trade more with them than the United States, or countries that have borrowed heavily under the Belt and Road Initiative should settle their transactions in Chinese currency, which actually in some ways is a help to the countries that are borrowed and indebted. But it also means that the use of the Chinese currency is becoming increasingly important. And certainly the Chinese strategy is to make it so. We don't know over a long term how this is going to work. But just to conclude, just let me say a little bit about the India-China relationship. I tried to capture it in a rather simple pictorial way. And you see there's a triangle at the middle. The blue are the areas of tension, and the yellow are the areas of commonality. And within that triangle, you see quite a lot of blue between the United States and India. I worry a little bit that this is now being misrepresented in the West. I mean, the American view, I think, is a little bit like the old John Foster Dulles saying, he may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch, that somehow India has been co-opted into our side in this sort of geopolitical struggle. But actually, I don't think that's the way the Indians see it. And there is potentially quite a lot of areas of difference. It's human rights issues. You read the papers today about the attempted assassination, extraterritorial assassination of Khalistan activists. China and India, there are difficult issues around the border, but there is China is the biggest trade partner in volume terms anyway, and they're both active in the BRICs group. And the US-China, well, we hear a great deal about. Of course, there's a lot of trade and investment overlap. There's a lot of common interest in the global commons. That's commons, not comms, as well as the obvious areas of disagreement around Taiwan, human rights, war risk decoupling. And I put Russia in and Pakistan to complete the circle. And then to just conclude with this, which is China and India, are they, allies, enemies, friends, enemies? There are significant areas of convergence, actually, which I think tend to be overlooked. They tend to have a common approach to Russia, a very common approach to secessionist terrorist groups. The Chinese would regard the Uyghur and Tibetan militants in that way. The Indians would regard the Kashmiri Muslim groups, and now the Kazakhstanis in the same way, and they deal with them pretty brutally, as we know. They both have a common approach to global governance reforms. There's an element of the thinking about the global South versus the global West. Crucially and increasingly importantly, standing up to the bullying West over climate and coal, what I call the strongman rule and the steel frame. The steel frame is the description the British used to give to the administrative structures in India, but it's having a common framework, shared values, political coherence, which, of course, the Communist Party gives to China, and the Sangh Parivar, the Hindu groups around the BJP, are beginning to provide in India, and an essentially state capitalist model with a mixture of open markets and protectionism. But the divergence is equally powerful. It may ultimately come to be more so around Pakistan, the disputed border, security alignments with the Indians being co-opted into the Quad system, confront China, arguably. An issue about whether the economies are competitive or complementary. And they are competitive in the sense that they're both importers of raw material, exporters of manufacturers, but within that, there is quite a lot of complementarity. Economic nationalism, TikTok is banned in India, amongst other things. And I put democracy, but with slightly, I probably should put quotation marks around that. There's a lot of people who wouldn't say that India doesn't get exactly 10 out of 10 these days. And perhaps just a final thought. I was in China till yesterday for a short visit, and the headline story in the Global Times, which is the English language version of the Communist Party newspaper, had a big banner headline describing a meeting of Chinese and South Pacific island states. This is, Samoa and Cook Islands, and it's headed something like Seminar on Democratic Governance. So perhaps, democracy is something that should go over to the other side. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vince. Professor Ferguson, floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Andrus, and thank you to Vince Cable for that excellent overview of the economics and geopolitics of an emergent world order. And I use the word emergent deliberately, because what's very striking about the presentation you've just seen is the complexity of the diagrams. It may have occurred to you, as it did to me, that the governance of the world increasingly resembles the governance of open AI, with perhaps similar potential to produce unexpected convulsions in short periods of time. Thank you very much for getting the slides set up while I was making that opening remark. I'm going to focus in just 10 minutes on the economic aspects of this emergent world order. And I think the argument I'm going to make is that this is a more bipolar order than the multipolar order that Vince showed you. In fact, what I'm going to suggest is that behind the OpenAI diagram, the flowchart of bewildering complexity, is a stark reality that there are two superpowers. And the real question for everybody else is, are you going to align yourself with one or the other, or try to remain non-aligned? It's now quite standard, and Vince did a version of this, to emphasize that shares of global output are shifting. And what I've done here is to take the latest IMF World Economic Outlook data and stack it so that you can see two things. One, the obvious point that the share of the G7 countries, a grouping that came into existence at French initiative in the 1970s, has declined quite significantly since the end of the Cold War, so that it's no longer half, it's now more like a third, slightly less, of global output. And if you then look at the BRICs countries, Brazil, China, India, Russia, and South Africa, their share has gone up massively from somewhere between 10 and 15% to approaching a third. But the second point that you're supposed to notice is that in each of these charts, there is one dominant power. if you just look there, the US is the dominant member of the G7, still, as it was at the beginning of the time series. And if you look here, China is overwhelmingly the most important member of the BRICs. And that's the first point that I want to emphasize. Though it may seem multipolar, in reality, it's a bipolar world. And in any case, these groupings should be regarded themselves with some skepticism. The group of seven was Giscard's idea. And it was quite an intelligent way to get the principal capitalist democracies to talk about economic issues in the wake of the great oil price shock of 50 years ago, 1973. And the G7 is really a legacy of the 1970s energy crisis. The BRICS grouping was invented by Goldman Sachs as a marketing tool. Jim O'Neill thought it would be a great way to get Goldman clients to invest in certain emerging markets. In many ways, it no longer serves that function at all and has become an instrument of, I think, mostly Chinese propaganda. And therefore, we should be somewhat skeptical about what the BRICS really means. I think President Lula is the most credulous of BRICS leaders in believing that there might be one day a BRICS currency. I don't think anybody else believes that for a minute. And for reasons I'll come to, nor should we. To understand the extent to which it's really a two superpower world, let's look at manufacturing value added. The real story of the that's not me. The real story of the global order is a massive shift in manufacturing capacity from the United States to China. This occurred after China was admitted to the World Trade Organization, because in the early 2000s, 20 years ago, manufacturing value added in the US was 2 times that of China. Today, China's is 2 times that of the United States. That's the great reversal that's occurred in the global economy. If you look at the other countries, I just added Russia here to illustrate the point, they're kind of also rats in terms of manufacturing capacity. I think this is a really important illustration of my point, but I could illustrate it in many other ways. Suppose we looked at artificial intelligence compute. There would be 2 superpowers and the others would be essentially invisible. Now, what is interesting about the 2 superpower world of our time, which I've been inclined to call Cold War II, some of you may have heard me make this argument at an event earlier this term, is that unlike in Cold War I, the 2 superpowers are economically intertwined in a globalized world order that remains remarkably resilient. The standard story, which you've probably read in the Financial Times or The Economist, is that globalization is in crisis. At the World Economic Forum back in January, I was on a panel with Adam Tooze and others to debate this. And my point was that globalization is not really in crisis. It's reached a plateau, perhaps, but the idea that it's somehow falling apart or dying is really not borne out by the data. You can see here that world trade volume in relation to industrial production has kind of plateaued. You can see on the chart on the right that world trade in relation to world GDP has somewhat declined, but I think this is to overstate the problem. If you look at the share of the US trade deficit, which is China, it's down from half to a third. If you look at the extent to which Apple has relocated production out of China, it's down from 100% to maybe 90%. So when people write about deglobalization as some polycrisis, my response is nuts. The extent of decoupling is really quite limited. And that is despite a global financial crisis, a populist president who imposed tariffs on China, tariffs which have not been removed by the Biden administration, and a concerted bipartisan campaign in the United States to reduce America's strategic reliance on Chinese supply chains that followed the COVID-19 pandemic. It's astonishing how little these various shocks have affected the relationship. Bottom line, there are two superpowers measured by manufacturing or AI, or for that matter, quantum computing. And they exist, unlike in the first Cold War, in a highly globalized world economy. And it's very hard to decouple them, which is why Jake Sullivan now talks about de-risking, because they figured out they can't really decouple. The other issue that's sometimes raised, and Vince raised it by pointing out that there has been an increase in the volume of transactions in RMB, is there going to be some kind of dollar crisis at some point in our time? I've been asked this question more or less since I was a graduate student, and I think I've been writing pieces on this subject for more than 20 years. And people are always predicting the decline or death of the dollar. And it somehow never happens. The dollar gets strong, then it gets weak, then it gets strong. And you can see it here. If you just look at the real effective exchange rate going back to the year I was born, 1964, there's a series of waves, but there's not some kind of terminal crisis. On the contrary, the dollar's remarkably steadily the dominant currency in foreign exchange reserves. You can see that in the chart here. There hasn't really been any significant change in the US dollar's share of international reserves. It's down a tiny fraction relative to where it was 20 years ago. But actually, if you go further back to the 1990s, it's up relative to the mid-1990s. If you take this very long-term perspective, it's essentially a dollar world in which the euro has become a significant currency, and the other currencies really don't play a significant role. The zoom bar confuses this and other charts by concealing the legend, but obviously the dollar and euro are the lines that are largest here, and the yen's share is really much smaller. If one looks at transaction volumes, not reserves, but transactions, the dollar's dominance is even more striking. So if these are Bank for International Settlements data, and the blue bars here show the massive 90% share of global transactions that are still dollar denominated, and the only real contender, the dark blue bars, is the euro. It's true the orange bars are the Chinese share, that's gone up, but it's still single digits as a share of global transactions. What is interesting is the concerted effort by China to increase, and Vince alluded to this, I think it's important to increase use of the RMB. There are two things to watch here. Offshore renminbi clearing facilities, which are important for people who want to get out of RMB. It's no longer an entirely non-convertible currency, and the increasing significance of renminbi swap lines. Though compared with Federal Reserve swap lines, these are still a kind of rounding error. So China is bidding to increase the importance of its currency, but it has a very long way indeed to go. In currency terms, there's only one superpower. I'm nearly done. Remember, there's a huge difference that emerges if you measure gross domestic product in current dollar terms rather than on a PPP basis. If you use the PPP basis, then it looks like China is already the biggest economy. If you use the current dollar basis, which is the lower blue line here, you can see that China actually reached a peak and has somewhat retreated. And that's, of course, reflecting the fact that the Chinese currency has, in fact, been somewhat weak in recent times. Couple final points. When people tell you that there's this huge shift happening from the G7 to the BRICs, I ask them to follow the money. Where does the money go when you ask the world's wealthy, where would you invest? And the answer, which you can see clearly in this map, is that it leaves the BRICs in very large quantities and it heads to the G7 and particularly to the United States. And these are really, I think, very telling flows. If China had a truly convertible currency, the flows from China to the US, and I suspect to the UK, would be on such a scale that it would hugely destabilize the global economy, which is why China cannot, in fact, have a convertible currency. And so I think this tells us a very different story from the slides that I began with. Yeah, there are two superpowers and there are clusters of lesser powers around them. But if you ask where the wealthy in the BRICS countries would like to invest, the answer is that they would very much like to invest in the group of 7 countries because they have rule of law and private property rights, which in reality, the BRICS countries don't have with much strength. If you're an economist reader, you might have noticed these striking magazine covers that Zanny Minton Beddoes published this year, and I kind of like them because they go against the narrative that the world is shifting from west to east or global south, if you like that expression, which I don't. In reality, it's still a very US-dominated world technologically, in currency terms, and geopolitically behind the open AI global governance chart that Vince showed us. So my perspective is somewhat different from his, and that's what you came to hear, some debate. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much, Neil. Rebecca will be speaking from right here where she is. Rebecca, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. So my name's Rebecca Naden, and I want to move us away a little bit from economics. Just to give you a bit of background, I spent several years in China. I was there under Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and Xi Jinping, so in total about 17 years. And I worked for the UK government for most of that time, and also worked extensively with various elements of the Chinese government. And I'm going to move us away from economics because you've heard a lot about that from 2 eminent economists, but also to think a little bit about the title of today's talk, which is Global Disorder. And disorder is sort of it's one of perspective. So for some, things might seem very ordered, for others, disorder. And I want to talk a little bit about, where China sees things. So we hear a lot about China's rise and what China's doing, but fundamentally, it's about domestic politics, domestic agendas. And China, luckily for us, it's very clear actually what is intended. So the clear message from the government is it's about delivering the 2 centenary goals. So those are to deliver a moderately prosperous society by 2021 and to build an advanced modernist socialist country by 2049. And how China then approaches to achieve that, it sees and articulates for us 4 kind of key areas. One is the management of great power relations, and we can talk a bit later about how successful that has been in terms of US, Russia, etc. Secondly is about securing China's periphery. So periphery diplomacy, or China's near abroad, is absolutely fundamentally important to that. So I sort of push back a little bit when I hear people say China's rise kind of started in 2012 with Xi Jinping coming to power, and the BRI is kind of China's big initiative to sort of take over the world. Well, actually, if we think and take a step back, we can see that many of the policies, particularly in terms of BRI, it's about outward investment, and this is not new. This has been going on for some time. And when we talk about, or when the government talks about the importance of national rejuvenation, which has been often attributed to Xi Jinping, this actually appears for the first time in 1997. Actually, Jiang Zemin talks about this. So China's actually quite clear. It's about growing and building up the country. And to do that, it emphasizes strongly this cooperation with developing countries. So this is now why we see a lot of talk about China's engagement with the Global South. But again, this is not new engagement. So China and the Global South go back to 1955, to the Bandung Conference. We have China delivering aid to Vietnam and other countries, even during the period of great turmoil in China, such as Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward. But then also we hear now increasingly discussions around building a new model of international relations. And I think it's this that gets Western analysts and Western governments quite nervous. And I think that's where we need to have a better understanding of what we mean by global governments or the rules-based international order, and what China means by that. So what we can see is that China is struggling, if we think about sort of globalization, it's at the moment struggling with this concept of comprehensive connectivity versus self-reliance. And that came through quite clearly, I think, in the two sessions, the Lianghui, which happened in March of this year. And we could see the really strong focus on the need for self-reliance in terms of food and energy and tech. So here there was a big emphasis on increasing funding for chip development. So again, here you see the sort of tensions with the US there. So China committed an increase of nearly 50% to 13.3 billion RMB in 2023, up from in 2022. We also saw a strong focus on food security. But again, this has always been a priority for the Chinese government. And we also saw, again, a focus on civil military integration. But what I'm trying to say is that how China is developing its partnerships with different countries in the world, yes, it's about economics, but also it is increasingly about soft power. It's about exchanging worldview. So China, I think, borrowed extensively from Keohane and Nye, who did a lot of work on this, understanding the importance of that soft power influence. And what we're increasingly seeing, and an assessment of how this is landing, is China solutions. So China solutions are being proposed in many fields, and there is a lot of criticism of those, whether it's China's approach to Middle East peace, to Ukraine, etc. Whether they're successful or not, I don't think at this point is what's important. What's important is that they are being proposed, and that there is a certain amount of funding and support behind that. So we saw an increase of 12.2% for China's diplomatic efforts, and this whole plethora of initiatives, the Global Development Initiative, the Global AI Governance Initiative, the Global Data Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative. And I'm asked a lot by people, what does this really mean? This is just rhetoric. Well, what's actually important is to understand what lies beneath those initiatives. What are the policies that China is rolling out? What are the bilateral relationships that it's investing in under those? And I think one of the key areas that we saw in the post, just after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, was that China was strongly positioning itself as a champion of the developing world. So it was positioning itself, Wang Yi saying, the Ukraine crisis, this is something that's happening in Europe, but actually it's Africa that's being victimized here, and we should not forget Africa, and we shouldn't forget Pakistan and other countries. And when we think then about the international system, so we talked a lot about economics, but actually the international systems, or the rules-based international order, is about political discourse, but it's also very much grounded in international law. And what we have seen is China increasingly putting forward and proposing different pieces of international legislation. So, for example, there's the draft treaty on the prevention of placement of weapons in outer space. We've seen engagement by China in the use of autonomous weapons systems within some of these UN groups, same in field of information and telecoms, same in cyberspace, and of course other areas such as UNCLOS. So I think when we talk about China reforming the international system, one could ask the question, well, wouldn't any country want to do that in areas that it perceives as being negative to its own national interest? So before everybody says, oh, are you a China hawk? Are you a dove? I'm neither. I'm simply trying to put forward a perspective of how China is viewing risk and how China is viewing threat. Some of those risks are internal. By that, I mean issues such as climate change, for example, food security, as I've mentioned, economic growth, provincial debt, youth underemployment. Again, many of these issues that other countries are grappling with, and then external threats too. And what we can see quite clearly is that for China, going back to the point about safeguarding the periphery, that actually many of the main security concerns for China are in its near abroad. And what we have seen in response to the West's approach to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, sanctions, etc. So China, we've seen a plethora of legislation coming out that China is plugging some of those security loopholes. So we have the anti-foreign sanctions law, the anti-espionage law, the foreign relations law. So again, really putting forward pieces of legislation which it hopes will create different sets of norms and standards. In addition, we also see really a huge growth in the number of forums that China has created. So some of the obvious ones, of course, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but also a whole plethora of forums, mechanisms in the space of media and digital space. We have the China UAE Space Debris Joint Monitoring Center. We have the China ASEAN Media Cooperation Forum, the China Africa Media Cooperation Forum. Also in the space of mining, ASEAN Mining Cooperation Platform. So again, this sort of thinking about norms and standards from a different world view. And I would argue that there are points, as Vince mentioned, points of convergence, but also points of divergence. And it is up to the West, I think, to understand some of the challenges that China is facing, some of the risks, how it perceives the risks, and to sort of perhaps build some of those bridges to better understand where each one is coming from. So going back to my earlier point, whether something is disorderly or orderly really does depend where you are sitting.
Thank you very much. Forgive me if I use, not abuse, my chair's privilege and ask one quick question of each one of our speakers, and then I will be happy to open it up to questions from the floor and the online audience. Vince, you spent some time looking at the apparent contrast, or the real contrast, I should say, between countries' share in world GDP and their shares in IMF voting power. And yes, clearly, China has much less than it ought to. Belgium, which you didn't have, has a lot more than one would imagine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there are two caveats here, and I'd like to get your thoughts on what I think are the two obvious caveats. First of all, is that banks are typically controlled by the people who lend the money, not by the people who borrow the money. So there's a case to be made for China, if China becomes a lender, to be, in the driver's seat. But there isn't much of a case for, say, India, which is mostly a borrower from the World Bank or the IMF, to be in the driver's seat, because, the people who benefit from borrowing the money are not typically the people who set the terms of the loans. And in addition, and this is more about China than about India, being at the driver's seat in the IMF means being part of a network of relationships and agreements and practices which China has been quite reluctant to embrace. For instance, if you're going to restructure Latin American debt, African debt, low-income country debt, the rules by which you play, their haircuts that you provide, there are clubs like the London Club and the Paris Club that you join. China has done none of the above. So I could see why China would want to see that they're getting a raw deal at the IMF. But do they really want a non-raw deal? Do they want to embrace all the baggage that comes with a good deal?
Yeah, well, on the first point, yeah, the real world is that lenders will tend to dominate banking institutions. But as you say, China isn't a borrower, but the main problem is countries like India.
Right.
In the Asian Infrastructure Bank, India has been allowed a disproportionately big role.
Right.
But I think that the key point is your second one, which is that if you're wanting to be part of the system, how does this play out with things like debt relief? I mean, my sense is that although the Chinese haven't signed up to institutions like the Paris Club,
Right.
they are operating a parallel system. They did through the pandemic roll over a lot of African debt. They are currently writing off or postponing, not writing off, they're currently postponing a lot of debt for countries that are critical. And we're talking large sums of money, $1 trillion, something of this order of magnitude.
Yeah, well, part of the problem is that we don't quite know, right? Because all these loans are semi-secret.
And I think this is actually an area where, if we're being creative in the West, we should be trying to engage the Chinese. I mean, I went to China primarily to talk about this whole issue about the Global Development Initiative and what it means, in particularly in areas like debt relief. And, there certainly is a tendency within the Chinese leadership, I think, the more liberal element, if we want to use a bit of jargon, to say that, well, it's in our interest to join in these fairly uncontroversial areas of global governance and play more of a role. At the current, there is a lot of Chinese money going into debt relief. I mean, it still doesn't form part of the numbers that we use, but it is actually happening. The condition they attach to it is that it should be conducted in Chinese currency. And in fact, if they're killing two birds with one stone, they're providing debt relief, they're postponing debt payments from some of the highly indebted African countries, but they're insisting that future relationships should be based on use of the Chinese currency. So, I mean, your point has a good deal of force, but I think we can see some evidence that they are adopting a more collegiate multinational approach to these problems.
Who knows? I am a little bit more skeptical than you are that, in fact, they are granting effective debt relief. There's a lot of shuffling of paper and a lot of redenomination of currencies. Whether African countries are actually getting a better deal than they had to begin with, I do not know. But I'm afraid that we're all at the level of conjecture because all the numbers here are not. If I want to know how much a country owes the IMF, I can go online. If I want to know how much a country owes China, I have no idea where I can go. We're beginning to assemble numbers. But in any case, let's move on. Neil, you said a number of things that I agreed with, but one thing that puzzled me, and I wonder what exactly you have in mind. You said that inevitably, down the road at some point, you didn't give us a year, countries will have to choose between the two big boys on the block. So far, I see little evidence of that. Think of Brazil, which is not a small country. Yes, Brazil goes to all the parties with the BRICs, and I want to ask Rebecca a question about the BRICS. So this is not a question about the BRICS. But Lula was very keen to get invited to Joe Biden's White House. So what down the road could be the factor that at some point, which is the gun that is pointed at Brazil's head? And I'm saying Brazil, I could say any other country in Africa, in Latin America, and bits of Asia or the Middle East that would force that country to say, oh, China, US, why can't we be somewhere in the middle?
Thank you, Andres. First of all, I think I'd just add that I kind of agree with you on the opacity of Chinese lending in developing and frontier markets. Carmen Reinhardt has done the best work on this. And if you look at Carmen's most recent research, it's pretty clear that the terms are a good deal less attractive than the kind of terms that these countries are getting when they restructure their debts with the Western institutions. I don't think I said that everybody will have to choose. If I did, I misspoke. The characteristic feature of Cold Wars is that some countries get to be non-aligned. And Brazil might just be a good example of a country that can be non-aligned in this particular Cold War. But not everybody has that option. If you take, for example, Germany, opinion polls that were done a couple of years ago by the Körber Stiftung revealed somewhat shockingly that a large proportion of Germans in the event of a US-China conflict would rather be aligned with China. This is a bizarre thing for any German to believe, considering the heavy reliance the Federal Republic has had on the United States for its security since its inception. So the key point is that if you are reliant on the United States for a significant part of your security, and that is essentially being a NATO country or being an ally of the United States elsewhere in the world, it doesn't matter how much trade you're doing with China. In the event of a crunch, you are not going to be able to be non-aligned. And the reason is secondary sanctions. One has to bear in mind that in Cold War II, because of the high level of economic interdependence, the United States can engage in purely economic forms of what might be called warfare. And sanctions, financial sanctions in particular, are a pretty good example of this. The United States in the last 22 years has developed a whole range of new forms of economic coercion. Financial sanctions are one, and now export controls are the other. These were old Cold War tools in the second case, but they've been dusted down and made very powerful. And a good illustration of this, and this is, I think, a good example of what the Cold War is all about today, is you have a meeting in San Francisco, which is presented in the media as a sort of détente-like event. And there are kind of happy goings on in Woodside. It's actually quite near where I live, that villa where she and Joe Biden met. But in reality, the thing that most matters, which is the economic measures the Commerce Department has taken to restrict Chinese access to the most sophisticated semiconductors, is not on the table. I mean, it's mentioned in the Chinese readout, but not in the US readout, in the same way that Taiwan is mentioned in the Chinese readout, but not mentioned in the US readout. And these measures are extremely powerful. It's very, very hazardous to get on the wrong side of the US. If it says you're a Dutch company and ASML says you can't sell your technology to China, don't test that. In the same way that if you're a bank and the US government says you mustn't engage in transactions with this entity, it's a very bad idea to say we're going to do it anyway, because they can put you out of business. So this is, I think, the kind of issue that seems to me to reveal the, if you like, the true substructure of the international order today. And it's not really about multilateral institutions when it comes to the crunch.
Thank you. Rebecca, you gave us a very good view of what the world looks like from Beijing, not from Washington. I thought that was very, very helpful. But you didn't tell us much about the BRICS, so let me get your thoughts on the BRICS. I always wonder what the BRICS is all about. I can figure out what the BRICS does for Vladimir Putin. It gives him a party that he can be invited to because nobody else will invite him to any other parties. I can see what the BRICS does for the presidents of South Africa and Brazil. It creates the illusion that they have world power when they really have none. They're vanity projects. It couldn't be about the global South because, you know, China's in the Northern Hemisphere and so are most of the countries that belong to the BRICS. So looked at from Beijing, what kind of a project is the BRICS? Not a Goldman Sachs project. What is it then?
I Thank you. So I think what's interesting about the BRICS for China is the fact that this week Xi Jinping delivered a speech virtually to the BRICS, and it was the first speech that she gave on Israel, Hamas, Israel, Gaza. So he chooses the BRICS to deliver this speech. So before that, you know, Wang Yi and others have been talking about it, Li Qiang, etc. So I think for China, the BRICS is important in terms of that positioning itself as in this reform and development of global governance. And earlier in September, China released its proposal on the reform and development of global governance. And you know, in that, it was clear that the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, were to be seen as much more important entities. Of course, how the BRICS plays out, because India, in the same with India in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But what we see, I think, is all entities and institutions such as SCO, BRICS, etc. China will seek to use those to reinforce its position on key issues of strategic importance to China. Right. So South China Sea issues, Taiwan, Hong Kong, etc., etc. And also to utilize those forums to be able to say, make sort of strong statements. For example, in the proposal on the reform of global governments, it's quite clear that China, in terms of Ukraine, says the root cause of the crisis lies in the problem of security governance in Europe. So if the problem lies in security governance in Europe, actually here's our global security initiative that we're going to put forward. And I think the fact, as I say, that he used that forum to give that very first speech from Xi himself on the topic shows the importance that's attached to it.
So Neil said the BRICS was a vehicle for Chinese propaganda. You said it much more politely, but you didn't say something that was so different. Am I reading you right?
I think propaganda.
Echo chamber, dissemination of one's thoughts.
I think it's about the Global Development Initiative, for example. All of these initiatives, the Belt and Road, this is all about testing, I think, piloting China's vision of its development model. How does this land in these different countries? So in China, piloting things is very common. So a certain province would pilot carbon markets or pilot sponge cities or whatever. And actually the same, I think, here. So it's about testing the water. So one side you could say it's propaganda. On the other side, you could say, well, we're just doing a very high level focus group.
I'm not sure. The President of Brazil would like to think of himself as a member of a focus group, but yes, I can see your point.
Can I just
quickly, please, because we want to turn to the audience.
I found what Rebecca had to say fascinating, and I think there are continuities that predate Xi Jinping, but it felt that you overdid that. It seems to me that there has been really quite a significant change since Xi took over in the way in which China deals with the rest of the world. They've dialed it back because wolf warrior diplomacy went so wrong. But I don't think one can really present the story of China's engagement with the world in quite the way that I thought you did, as some kind of seamless transition that can date almost as far back as Bandung. Surely there's been a pretty decisive change since Xi came to power. And I don't base this on, I don't know, reading Matt Pottinger. I base this on talking to my Chinese friends. I mean, there's a reasonable number of Chinese people in the room. I'd be amazed if they, in their hearts, I'm not asking you to vote, folks, but if they agreed with your view that the real theme of Chinese policy is one of continuity. I see huge discontinuity.
Well, I suppose I saw the contraction. If you're talking about like the security sort of tightening, to me, because I mean, I was there in China at the time, that really sort of starts in 07. So you used to see, my point was being that many of the ambitions that are stated by Xi Jinping are party ambitions. That was the point. How the governance is working in China, how the decision making in China has changed. Yes, so in Deng's era, we had much more consensus building, so that was a reflection from in reaction to the Mao era, and then we have seen perhaps much more Xi taking control of those decision making. But on foreign policy, we also see a huge amount of Xi delegating. So he's delegating to Wang Yi, he's delegating to Li Qiang to attend these forums. So my point was that it was not Xi Jinping who came up with the Belt and Road, and it was not Xi Jinping who came up with China's ambitions for national rejuvenation. That's a party goal. So that's where the continuity is where they see China going. Same with the 2 centenary goals. These are not Xi Jinping's goals. How you go about delivering that, yes, Xi has a distinct style, but the actual kind of where you're going isn't Xi.
Vince, you want to come in on this? China, continuity or break? Briefly, and then we will turn to the audience.
I'll pass on that. I did want to pick up the gauntlet that Niall threw down about currency.
All right.
Just allowed to respond.
Okay, that'd be a good one.
I mean, you set that position very clearly, the dollar dominance. I mean, there are several things where he may well be right. I mean, I'm not going to move my pension funds into RMB, but there are several reasons for, I think, doubting. First of all, we're at the top of the interest rate tightening cycle in the US, and that may make a significant difference once it unwinds. I think, secondly, the capacity of a dysfunctional democracy in America to do something stupid is not to be underestimated. They may re-elect President Trump, and the Congress may well, having gone to the brink on default, may actually do something, and that will really shake confidence in dollar holders. A third thing that was crucial was the way in which the financial sanctions against Russia have really shaken the confidence of rich people in having their assets in a particular basket. And a lot of Chinese people have rethought whether having money and property in the UK is such a good idea if there's sanctions coming down the road. And it's not just rich individuals. I mean, if you're Saudi Arabia, very rich player, do you really want to be tied exclusively to the US? And the Saudis have been, of course, diversifying their transactions into Chinese currency. So there's several reasons for having questions about the dollar. And of course, the Chinese themselves are improving the functional efficiency of their electronic RMB currency. They're doing it on a piloting basis in the provinces. I think there've been all kind of glitches, but they may well produce a system, and we know the Chinese are very good at this, producing a system that actually works and works well and is cheaper and more efficient than anything anybody else can produce. So some grounds for skepticism, I think.
I'm actually going to come in and briefly. I'm not going to give you the floor again because I want to turn to the audience.
I have answers.
All right. Very briefly, world reserves, share of world reserves in Chinese RMB, 3%. 10 years ago, 2.8%. There is no trend toward substantial holdings of people's wealth across the world in RMB. Maybe it'll happen 20 years from now. Maybe it won't. I think you're absolutely right. The United States has an extraordinary capacity to misgovern itself. But the extraordinary thing is that every time that the United States Congress refuses to move the debt ceiling, and every time the US comes to the edge of default, the dollar appreciates. The remarkable thing about the dollar is when the world is going south, the dollar appreciates. When the world is booming, the dollar appreciates too. No matter what happens, the dollar appreciates. And maybe that will change, but I can't see it changing anytime soon. For a good academic reference on this, my favorite expert on the subject, a guy called Ishwar Prasad, professor at Cornell in the US, the lovely piece in Finance and Development, the magazine published by the IMF, in which he says, we are stuck with the dollar for a very long time. There's a gentleman in the back there in the blue for a long time has been eagerly trying to get a microphone, and he's going to get one any minute now. Thank you. Please tell us a bit who you are, and then keep the questions short, if you will, please.
Thank you. Stuart MacDonald. I'm a postgrad student here at LSE, and I work in Whitehall too. Question for Professor Ferguson on the point of countries choosing between the two superpowers again. Even with secondary sanctions and exclusive security relationships, will still more middle powers hedge and work with China when they want and need to? India being the obvious example, but you could look at Egypt, Turkey, and many others. Thank you.
If you read the rather good paper Jared Cohen did for Goldman a couple of months ago, he gives the answer that there'll be lots of hedging. Go to Singapore. I was there 3 weeks ago, and you talk to the government there, that the whole strategy is to try to have it both ways. It's not so much non-alignment as polyamorous Cold War, where you kind of go one way 1 week. And this is India's strategy. It's like show up to the BRICs, show up in Washington, get feted like you've just joined NATO. And it's kind of fascinating to watch that you can get away with this now. You can get away with it when the chips aren't down. But let's just ask the question, hypothetical question, what if after the Taiwanese election in January, China imposes a blockade on Taiwan? What then? And that will change everything, because at that point, you will enter a much, much larger scale crisis than anything we've seen with Ukraine or Israel. And I think at that point, the hedging and fluffing will have to stop.
Gentleman here in the gray jacket.
My name is Rafael. I am an LSE alumnus. Thank you for an insightful discussion, and I wanted to follow up on the comment. So, in Stockholm, Russia is hugely detrimental to the world economy. Like Russia is the largest country in the world, the 11th largest economy, and we all feel the consequences of that in major parts of the world. And to what extent India, China, and the global south, such as Turkey, benefit from the sanctions against Russia? Because they have not joined them, and they are benefiting from the commodities and from trade with Russia. Thank you.
I think plenty of countries are benefiting, although just for the record, Russia's economy is smaller than Spain's. I love Spain, but the world does not wake up in the morning thinking, will the economy of Spain still be around tomorrow? More like, can we go on holiday there? But the question is not aimed at me. So please, who'd like to pick this up? Vince?
Well, the Ukraine war has, I don't think is terribly helpful to China, because it's indirectly led to alienating much of Western Europe. But it's been of considerable benefit to India, which has a purely transactional approach to this. They've got very good traditional relationship with Russia. They now have access to a lot of cheaper oil, and as far as one can see, the very complex model for dealing with oil supplies, which the Americans dreamt up through Janet Yellen's scheme, is simply not working. And it's mainly because of, shadow vessels, which the Chinese fleets and Indian fleets are taking full advantage of.
I mean, part of the problem is that if you're the Biden administration, you can't really do anything that fully bottles up Russian oil, because you don't really want to spike oil prices. And so there always was a contradiction at the heart of the sanctions regime. First, it was oversold as something that would somehow bring the Russian war machine to its knees. I never believed that for a second. It's extremely hard to impose sanctions on such a large economy as Russia's. But I don't think actually the sanctions have been enforced in the way that they might have been, because if you were to really cut Russia off, the inflationary effects would be highly detrimental to US
domestic economic interests and therefore the political interests of the administration. That's why the sanctions aren't really enforced as they might have been expected to be.
One word on behalf of the LSE. I was at a conference in Abu Dhabi 2 days ago. An LSE professor, a man called Dmitry Mukin from the Department of Economics, presented a paper arguing that in fact the sanctions have been a lot more effective than it seems. I mean, there are good reasons. I won't go into the details of a very sophisticated model he presented why, even though the sanctions may be binding, the Russian ruble may still have appreciated. But his view was that they have bitten more than, say, a casual reading of the FT would suggest. But let me, please, yes.
Just one point on that. I think what the sanctions have done is also particularly like in Central Asia. So as Russia has become more diplomatically isolated, I think you can see some of the Central Asian countries, of course, they're trying to balance, this position. But, countries such as Tajikistan have been able to get some concessions out of the Russians that they perhaps wouldn't have been able to get beforehand. So I think one of those has been able to get the Russians to finally label the Islamic Renaissance Party as a terrorist organization and stuff like that. So if Russia hadn't been as weakened, it wouldn't have the negotiating position and so on.
I mean, just to add a tiny point about this, I think it illustrates very well my bipolar world that ultimately Russia's been able to avoid the economic pain that was supposed to be inflicted, partly because China's exports to Russia have greatly increased, especially of things like semiconductors and dual-use technology, much of which does actually make it to the battlefield. And the US has decided to have a very tight definition of what constitutes lethal aid, but actually a lot of what comes from China to Russia does end up contributing to the war effort. So I mean, I think that's a really important point about this war. The US and the European Union and a few others keep Ukraine in the war, but China to a large extent keeps Russia in the war. And that's why the war will keep going. Notice in Cold Wars, the proxy war phenomenon ensures that wars keep going because the superpowers provide resources that otherwise wouldn't be available. And it's hard to keep a war like this going without those outside resources because it's a very destructive war.
Right there, please. Yes, sir. Yes. Microphone over here. Yes. I will try to be equitable as to which side of the room we pick. So I'll go over there next. Yes, sir, please.
Raji Kuri, LSE alum. Neil, you mentioned Taiwan and China, and then we get Ukraine and Russia. We have the Middle East. I do agree with you that the US is still, everything is dollar denominated. I mean, even Bitcoin, which is supposed to be an alt currency, is in dollars. Oil is in dollars. But as we see these different fires exploding in the world, is there potential for these fires to get connected and get into something bigger? And that's quite costly to the US. I mean, look at the level of indebtedness in the US and the rate of paying interest on 10-year yields at the moment. Would that actually create some hindrance to the dominance of the US in the global economy?
Would like to respond to that.
I can give a quick response. The US has been on an unsustainable fiscal trajectory for a long time. It's 20 years since I published a book called Colossus warning about this. It's only got worse. And you now have the reality that defense spending is exceeded by debt service. I think that's for the first time in a long time this quarter. That's not a great situation to be in. The debt to GDP ratio is shockingly high. The trajectory is appalling if you look at the most recent Congressional Budget Office projections. This goes to Vince's point that the US is sort of riding for a fall. And so it's a disturbing situation, and it's not immediately obvious how this gets fixed because the politics of fiscal reform seems completely intractable in Washington, to the point that any candidate who talks about it loses. So I take all that extremely seriously. And if you can imagine the crises, as it were, congealing so that you have one in Eastern Europe and then one in the Middle East and then one in the Far East, and who knows what North Korea will do under these circumstances, it can get very nasty indeed very fast. And that will be the moment of truth, because I think in Vince's scenario, if the US were to lose credibility in the Indo-Pacific, if it were to bungle a Taiwan crisis, then I think the consequences for the dollar and for the 10-year treasury would be very severe. And I think we're closer to that moment of truth than most people want to face. So that's the short answer. I'll add one tiny point, which maybe Rebecca can comment on. The public finances of China are actually worse. Because if you do what the IMF has done recently, and you look at the local government liabilities, and you actually do a proper calculation of public sector debt, the aggregate debt to GDP number's about the same as the US. But the deficit, if you include the local governments, is much larger. And in a way, China's problem, which I think is the problem I'd rather not have. I mean, US problem is essentially a political problem. China's problem is a structural problem, which is that you've got 29% of the economy's real estate, it's in the tank, and there's no real way to solve that problem because you can't keep building tower blocks for nobody with a shrinking population. That structural problem is a worse one. And I think it means that over the 10 to 20-year time horizon, Cold War II will probably go the way of the West. But if there's a showdown over Taiwan and the US and Biden and company flunk it, then all bets are off and you're away to the races with the dollar. Can I quote the Larry Summers aphorism on the dollar just because it's fun and maybe not everybody knows it? So a couple of years ago, Larry was asked a question about the dollar and the challenges to it. And he said, you can't replace, I won't do the accent, you can't replace something with nothing. What are you going to do if Europe's a museum, Japan's an elderly care home, China's a jail, and Bitcoin's an experiment? It's a good line.
You've got gold.
No, there's gold. That's not
Rebecca, you want to comment on that? Is China destined for fiscal trouble or political trouble or both?
I mean, I agree with Mal in terms of, which is why I sort of mentioned it earlier, in terms of the provincial debt, and as Mal says, the issues of the real estate. I think the other challenge as well is that, you know, whilst there is lots of government policies coming out at the moment about encouraging the private sector, and Li Qiang's really kind of pushing this, at the same time you've got this contraction and all of these new pieces of legislation that make it very difficult to attract foreign investment as well. So there's certainly a Maldwin there, there's certainly a contradiction there.
Yes, lady right there in the front row on that side, please. Thank you.
I'm from the LSE alumni. Just want to ask a question, asking Rebecca about the soft power of China. How do you see China's role in the internet world? For example, TikTok, and also a lot of propaganda from the little pinkies affecting Western opinions.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. I mean, there is a huge amount of influence by China in terms of social media, TikTok, as you say, also the amount of investment that China has undertaken, particularly let's say in Africa, which is why I drew attention to the various media exchanges. By that I mean not just you know, traditional media, which includes the training of journalists, etc., but also on social media. And we saw the huge efforts that were undertaken by China around countering some of the narratives on COVID, on vaccines, etc. So this is a challenge. I mean, and the issue of disinformation, misinformation, particularly as technology evolves, artificial intelligence and deep fakes. This is increasingly a challenge.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to be equitable. I'm going to go upstairs. We will take one question from the online audience, and then I suspect we have to call it a day. Yes, sir, up there. We can, yes. Yeah. Well, preach on, but briefly.
All right. My name is Varun. I the program. My question is around India. India, and I hope this doesn't offend anyone, has been one of the most overhyped countries in the 21st century, and every year has been India's year, and every decade's been India's decade. So with India muddling through, especially in, from an economic perspective and not just a geopolitical perspective, how do you think that's going to contribute or not contribute at all to the global order or disorder you're talking about? Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Vince,
one of
tell
the
us about-
interesting things is that all the feedback from the floor, because nobody has mentioned India,
Yeah.
and there's a tendency, I think, just to write it off. I was at a seminar earlier this week in China, and the only area of dissent on the platform, because of course everybody was reciting familiar lines, was around India, where an Indian representative stood up and started attacking the Chinese very vociferously for saying, well, why do you ignore us? You don't send any visitors. We have no exchanges of students. You have a lot of soft power, but you're not show no interest in India, whatever. Why do you ignore us and focus entirely on the US relationship? And I think the answer to that is partly, well, this is arguably the third economy in the world, potentially the second. Why do we underestimate the role that India can play? I mean, Niall's charts at the beginning were kind of descriptions of past trends. And if, compound interest is quite a powerful phenomenon. And if you do extrapolate,
Right.
based on the kind of growth assumptions that we, are very plausible, India becomes a very big player in terms of the impact on global demand, potentially as an investment destination, and all the interconnections that come with that. And I think both, we as an audience and most of our countries, are just fundamentally underestimating the role that India could be playing internationally in 5-10 years' time.
I'd just like to go on the record and say that in 2008 in Delhi, I predicted that India would overtake China and that it would be like the tortoise and the hare in the fable. And this seemed like an outlandish thing to say, but it was already obvious to me that there were serious structural problems developing in the Chinese economy, particularly in the demography, that would not be such a handicap to India. So, and just to correct you, the chart I showed, in fact, included the latest IMF projections out to 2028. But the thing about lines like that is if you draw them forward into the future, which is what people love to do at investment banks, you are almost certainly going to be wrong. Just as the Samuelson macro textbook used to project the Soviet Union overtaking the United States in gross national product in edition after edition after edition, right the way into the 1980s. So I'm very, very skeptical that those lines will be reality for India. They weren't reality for China. I had a bet back in, I think it was 2019, with an eminent Chinese economist that China would not catch up with the US in terms of current dollar GDP. That seemed like a wildly outlandish bet then. It's no longer so outlandish. So although I try to stick to the past as a historian, I think part of what you are able to do as a historian is spot the more plausible trend than that wonderful upward slope that Jim O'Neill used to do with his BRICs charts.
Well, if people get paid very well to push lines in the future, they will push lines into the future. For the record, I was in Delhi 2 weeks ago at a conference of economists, and from the outside, macro management in India does not look too stellar, but I have to report the mood was jubilant. It was very bullish. The local JP Morgan and the local Goldman Sachs types we're all making pretty optimistic projections.
I agree with something Vince said, which is worth emphasizing. I think it will become more and more apparent that this is a very illiberal democracy that the US has embraced. And that is going to become progressively more and more of a headache for policymakers, especially Democrats, who kind of are supposed to care about those things.
Modi, you're talking about?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, actually, from an Indian perspective, that rating India as a democracy is something that hugely divides the political science community. I mean, there are some of these indices of liberal democracy that rate India today roughly where it was during Indira Gandhi's emergency, and there are others that look away. But this is a huge question for policymakers in the West. When Joe Biden talks about some great alliance of democracies, it's not liberal democracies if India is going to be really a big part of it.
Rebecca, you want to
Yeah,
join this?
just on the sort of India-China bit and the sort of global south, it was interesting to me that in September, as I say, China released this paper, this position on the reform of the development of global governance, and at the same time, Li Qiang was giving a speech in the UN Secretary General Assembly, Security Council, sorry, and it was like, China, we are the champions of the global south, we are the champions of the developing world, we are the world's sort of greatest developing country, etc. And then the sort of the Indian media was like, well, no, actually, we lead the global south, and it was us who came up with the non-aligned movement, and so there's this sort of strange competition for that mantle.
We haven't had a chance to talk about this, and there's presumably going to be another session when you can, but this is really not how the world looks to Africa. I mean, if you actually ask Africans, is China speaking for the global south? Is India? They will not give you the answer.
Actually,
Beijing or Delhi.
Yeah.
Well, actually, where I come from, you say global south and people get the jitters because first of all these countries are in the north. And secondly, as a Latin American, China and India or Iran, for that matter, speaking for us, oh, God forbid. I want to be equitable and give the audience online a chance to ask a question. I can't see Carolina, but Carolina was there somewhere with the questions. Do we have any online questions? Carolina, we do? We don't. All right, so we get one last question from the floor. The gentleman back there was very swift. Yes, sir. In the white. Yes. Can you grab a microphone, please?
So I think can you hear me?
Yes.
So I think one of the important parts of the story of China Rise is the perception of the Western decline emanating from the great financial crisis, that being an important part of China's emboldenedness. I'm wondering if, and this is to anyone, you believe that the U.S. has the political will to contain financialized interests that might contend with national interests. Thank you.
Would like to pick that one up. Vince, you want to get the last word of the day? Rebecca?
Vince, go ahead.
This is a
Well,
very
I
rare
think
occurrence in an LSE
I'll
panel.
happily answer the question and so that we can wrap this on a high note. What's interesting is that there was a perception, particularly I think in China, the financial crisis was the moment that the emperor turned out to have no clothes on, and that this was going to be a kind of decisive blow to the credibility of the United States as a leader. I remember those conversations when I was visiting Tsinghua, and it's turned out not to be true. I mean, the financial crisis was very problematic and challenging, but the United States overcame it. And it's outperformed the European economies in a really dramatic fashion since then. That's partly, I think, because of the reckless fiscal policy we discussed earlier, but there's no denying that there's also something going on there that is a great deal more impressive than people foresaw back in, say 2009. The problem in the United States is really not the mighty power of Wall Street. The problem is the inability of people in the political class to pass the very straightforward reforms of immigration and entitlements that would set the fiscal house in order. That's the problem in the United States. It's not a problem of financial interests. It's a problem of political parties.
The United States is basically a Latin American country when it comes to politics. That's why I don't live there anymore. But I will say one thing. Neil predicted that the day of reckoning for US fiscal policy is around the corner. I'm willing to put money on that. It is not. It is a lousy fiscal policy. It is bad for growth. It is bad for interest rates. But an Argentine financial crisis ain't going to be happening anytime soon, at least not in Washington. But I could be eating my words a year or two from now. I think at this point, we are aware that there's wine somewhere in this building and we would like to consume large amounts of it. But before we do that, we are going to give our panel a big round of applause.